My name is Wendy Rickman. I'm actually a little bit further down in the food chain at DHS, but I'm a division administrator for the policy division at DHS. So in my division, we set policy for FIP, cash assistance, for food assistance, for Medicaid, for child care, for dependent adult services, and for child welfare services. So we have a blended policy division. Let me begin by letting you know that Director Foxhoven sends his regrets. He and I were going to be here together today, and he was called out of town, so I'm going to kind of carry the show. He's trying to get his feet on the ground. I think he's well steeped in child welfare issues because he's practiced so long in juvenile court, but the whole Medicaid thing is kind of a learning curve for him, so he's been really running fast on the Medicaid stuff. Our intention today, when he and I met before this presentation, was rather than to do a big long PowerPoint, he is in the process right now of going from office to office, talking to our staff, talking to judges, talking to attorneys, and so really wanted this opportunity to be kind of an extension of that. So what I thought we would do is give you just a brief kind of overview of where we are at DHS at this point in child welfare stuff, and then really give you some time to either ask questions or tell us concerns or what's working right for you. So hopefully that'll work. In terms of just a general update, I'll start kind of with the budget. At DHS, our budgeting activity starts way before a lot of other state agencies because we're required to present our budget to a DHS council before it goes to the governor. So when they leave, when legislators leave in May or June or whenever they leave, we are already in the process of working on our next 2-year budget. We made our budget presentation to our council in September, or early October, September, I guess, for child welfare, as well as really kind of across state government at this point. We asked for a status quo budget. So what that means is there is no new money to put into our system from a child welfare perspective. We did ask for a little bit of backfill money because we had used some one-time money for this fiscal year. So going forward, we asked to backfill those dollars, but aside from that, our budget is status quo. And that is the same for the program side, which I'm responsible for, as well as the field side as it relates to workers in the field. So no anticipated increases in resources for sure. There's still a bit of a budget shortfall, and as that relates to DHS, just in general, the governor has a pretty reasonable expectation for the most part that state agencies meet their own budget obligations. So before we would look to Department of Transportation, Department of Ed, Department of Public Safety, if DHS has a budget hole, we're expected to try to figure out how to fill that. And that makes sense. The issue for us a lot of times is that our huge shortfalls really rest in Medicaid. And so to the extent that the other divisions, mental health and disability services, DDM, fiscal, we all try to contribute to filling that hole before we go ask for money. It's kind of kept our child welfare system in a status quo kind of situation for some time. So we didn't lose any resources going into the next year, but we also are not anticipating any big infusion of cash. In addition to that, so that's just kind of the budget thing. We'll see what comes back out from the governor's office. We're answering lots of questions for them at this point. But in the child welfare arena in particular, it's pretty much status quo. As you're probably aware, we had a couple of very tragic child deaths last year. So out of that has come a series of investigative kind of efforts. In addition to our own internal investigations, we have things going on with the Ombudsman's office. We have a legislative oversight committee that is really active in reviewing everything about those cases, but also kind of the general functioning of the child welfare system. And then we have contracted with a third-party kind of private provider, Paul Vincent's group, CFP, Children and Family Policy Center, maybe. Paul Vincent has been in the field of child welfare for many, many years. He has spent time in Iowa, so we contracted with his group to do an independent review of the system. So since the start of the summer, they have been having a series of conversations. They were in Cedar Rapids. Did you get to meet with them? Yeah. So they're at the point now where they've done all of their information gathering. Their first report is due to us later this fall to try to tell us which things they have identified that we should pay more attention to, do a little bit of a more deep dive into, to figure out what things we need to change. So lots of scrutiny on the child welfare system at this point from a lot of different angles, including our own internal continuing kind of investigation of things. So that certainly is on the horizon as well. So as we go into legislative session in January, I would anticipate child welfare legislation that hopefully addresses some of the things that folks are seeing as being problematic in the system. The most concrete thing that we've done is to put these new contracts on the ground starting July 1st. So I think last year when I was here, we were still in the process of doing our RFPs, and we really reprocured all of our out-of-home services. So they were cut into two primary contracts. The first was for the recruitment and retention and training support of our foster parents and that array. Those contracts were awarded to Four Oaks for 4 of our service areas. Lutheran Services in Iowa is in the western side, that big western service area. But Four Oaks is the contractor for the other 4 service areas. And if I back up just a minute, there were some things fundamentally that we changed in these contracts from how we had done business before July 1st. There were some fundamental shifts in how we were doing things. The first is that before July 1st, we had big statewide contracts. We decided to in this new procurement process, pay more attention to service area specific services. So all of our contracts that started July 1st are now service area specific. And that was important to us because when we looked at our data, it is not unusual for us to place kids 6 hours away from where they started. So we had all these Council Bluff kids in Dubuque, and we had all these Davenport kids sitting over in Des Moines. And if we think about what the child welfare system is intended to do, we started a conversation about what healthy families look like. And if we really want to be successful in child welfare, we have to have families that operate like other healthy families. So fundamentally for us, that means we would like to have families who protect their kids, not kids who are protected from their families, if in the end we're going to be healthy. So if you think about what happens from the very first time we get a call for an assessment, a lot of times in the interest of child safety, we immediately start to separate people. We separate kids from their parents, we separate kids from their siblings, we separate kids from their extended families, we separate kids from their communities, all kind of in that interest of safety. Fundamentally, that has to be tweaked if in the end we're going to have healthy families. So the idea of moving toward a system that really is interested in having kids that are protected by their families rather than from their families is part of what drove this kind of procurement thinking. So the RRTS, the Recruitment, Retention, Training, Support Contract, is structured with 4 Oaks and 4 service areas, Lutheran Services in Iowa in 1. It is probably the contract that concerns me the most and has for some time. So we made some big changes to that contract and the expectations in the contract. Probably the thing that is the most exciting about it at this point, I'll talk about in a minute. Because the other big contract that we did was for emergency services and shelter care, for foster group care, and then for supervised apartment living. The supervised apartment living piece ended up coming a little later because we didn't have good bidders the first time around. So we gathered a bunch of information, restructured those a little bit, and those just went into effect October 1st. So everything else started in July. Our new supervised apartment living contract started in October. In those contracts, not only did we do a service area specific procurement, so group care facilities are responsible more for kids in their service area than they ever have been before. In the foster group care, so our group care residential facilities, we also embedded the concept of having guaranteed beds. So let me talk about what that means. If you think about how group care worked before July 1st, our providers like Four Oaks and Lutheran and Family Resources, all those group care facilities were only paid if they had kids in their beds. And so what that meant was they didn't want to let kids go out of beds because that's the way they got paid. So from a business model perspective, it doesn't make sense to do better throughput with kids because that was the only way they were being paid. So fundamentally what we did was to say, we will pay you every day for a number of guaranteed beds so that you don't have to worry about your cash flow, but your performance is going to be based on how well you treat these kids when they're here, you partner with their families to get them back home, and any money that you have left over, you reinvest into community-based services. So the idea across the country, really, is to move a lot of these really bed-based facilities to community-based providers. And with less reliance on those long, long stays in group care. There are organizations across the country that have done this really well. And so the other thing that we did before we ever put these RFPs on the street is that we invested in some technical assistance specifically for our providers so that they could see a different business model as it related to going from being so bed-based and campus-based to being more community-based. The end of that vision, where we want to head, is that we think there are kids who technically would meet a level of care of foster group care, a facility, but if we can wrap the right services around them in their community, they don't have to go to a bed. That is the eventual vision. So in those contracts, what you're going to start to see, hopefully, is a reasonable migration of kids back to where they started. So no longer should we be taking kids from Council Bluffs and moving them 6 hours to Dubuque, where their families can't get to them, their workers can't get to them, they can't stay connected to the communities that they came from. Because one of the things that we know about our kids is that they go home. The kids that come into our system either stay home, they return home, or they go home when we're done with them. And so the idea that from a service perspective, we were making such huge separations in families just didn't make sense. When you look at our data, our kids since July have started to move closer to home. So we have those Council Bluffs kids going, rather than to Hillcrest or Family Resources, they're going to Boys Town, which is where they should be. Our Davenport kids are leaving facilities, and obviously we wanted to do it when it made sense for the kid, so we didn't just want kind of an arbitrary migration happening, but as it makes sense for the kids and families, those Davenport kids are leaving facilities in Des Moines and in you know, Waterloo, and heading back to Family Resources or to Hillcrest. So from a capacity perspective, we have enough money in the system at this point to do what it is we think we need to do, leaving out the idea of how many workers we have to do it. So our numbers of staff are obviously highly scrutinized at this point. But from a system programmatic perspective, we have enough money in the system to make these shifts. The interesting part about what's happening since July 1st, all of our contracts are performance-based. So what that means is they get some money up front, but then there is a percentage of those contracts in every one of the ones that I talk about. There's a percentage of that money, 5 to 10% of the contract value, that is held for performance measures. And the performance measures vary depending on the contract. So we have things about lengths of stay. We have things about kids not being re-abused. We have things about the need to have group care providers pay attention to families and not just the kids they have in their beds. They have to pay attention to those kids' families. We have things about regular visitation. So what is starting to happen now, because we've built these contracts in such an interdependent way, we have providers pushing on each other differently. So what do I mean by that? One of the performance measures in shelter is around lengths of stay. Shelter is intended to be a short-term emergency placement that should last less than 30 days. That's what it is intended to be. So if you have a kid sitting there 30, 60, 90, 120 days because we can't find a foster home for them, now instead of DHS saying, which we always have, to our RRTS provider, you have to find a foster home. Now we have shelter care providers who are saying to their peers, our RTS providers, you have to build up your foster home capacity. We have kids sitting here simply because we can't find a foster home. That is a healthy conversation to have. And so sitting in central office, I get a lot of phone calls about this back and forth between providers. They're arguing with each other. I love that. That's what we should be doing. From a system perspective, we are dependent on each other to do the right thing for these kids. And to the extent that they are now starting to have conversations with each other about how to be helpful with each other and also articulating some of those pressure points, I think that's a healthy thing for the system. So all of those contracts, with the exception of supervised apartment living, as I said, started July 1st. One of the things that I'm going to ask all of you is what you're hearing about that. In central office, I don't hear a lot of the success stories unless I go out into the service areas and hear some things that are working fairly well. Most of what I hear are the complaints, which is, that's what I get paid for, so that's all right. But I own all those contracts, so I'm the contract owner for all of those across the state and need to pay attention to a couple things. Are the contracts working as we intended them to work? And are there contractual barriers to doing good practice that we can resolve on our side? So we've done some amendments already to try to make it easier for folks. We try to eliminate barriers contractually. But the overall idea of how these were put into place and where we want to head really centers on the idea that we want these kids as close to their families as possible, that we want to not only think it's a good idea for them to see their families every once in a while, but we are mandating it. And so from an attorney perspective, whether you're a guardian ad litem in a case, whether you're a kid's attorney, whether you're representing parents, the idea that you guys push that forward is going to be really important. We spent a lot of time with judges before this thing all rolled out. We have great judges and we have resistant judges, just like we do in anything else. But we have continued to have conversations with them about kind of this shifting thinking as it relates to child welfare and juvenile justice. So you guys know, for all the services that I'm talking about, it's not just our China kids who are eligible. it's delinquent kids as well. So we had several chiefs, juvenile court chiefs, and some of their juvenile court officers on our planning teams. They had a lot to say about what these services look like going forward. Some of the concerns that they have, the biggest concern I hear right now is that they're a little worried about China kids being placed together with delinquents. That is an issue in some circumstances, although what I would say about that is that that didn't start July 1st. Our kids have always been placed together. So now that we have kind of this new conversation, it is resurfacing as a potential issue. So we're having conversations with our providers about delinquent cottages and China cottages slightly differently than we had before. But in general, those kids have always been placed together. So until you get to that really deep end where there are some big separations, we're just kind of seeing how it goes at this point. My counterpart over field, so the division administrator over field is Vern Armstrong. He and I are having regular conversations with the MCOs as it relates to behavioral health services, especially in these out-of-home placements. So just from a fiscal perspective, in a foster group care facility, so a facility like Four Oaks, child welfare pays for a maintenance rate daily, and we pay for a service rate. So we have a two-pronged kind of approach to that. The maintenance rate is meant to be basic food, clothing, shelter, supervision. The service rate is intended to push the provider to pay attention to that kid in the context of their family. In addition to that, all of our kids are Medicaid eligible. When they go into those out-of-home placements, part of our Medicaid state plan says now they're Medicaid eligible, which means not just health care, but behavioral health. So most of our kids are also getting behavioral health intervention services, BHIS, on the MCO side. To the extent that they are not authorizing enough services for those kids, it becomes a place for Vern and I to intervene on their behalf. So we're having lots of conversations about that. If a child is decertified for BHIS services in group care, we've asked for a specific conversation with the MCOs about that, because it can be one of two things, really. If that child really doesn't need behavioral health services, then I think that's on me, because they shouldn't be in group care, right? If they're not behaviorally out of control enough to be eligible for those behavioral health services, what are they doing in a facility? So that's part of why we want the conversation. If, though, that child is behaviorally acting out over and over and over again every day, and they are decertified, then we argue with the MCOs about it and bring evidence to the table, because then they belong in group care and they have to have the services necessary to help with those behaviors. So it's, sometimes I feel kind of Trumpian. It's complicated. These services are complicated, but we think we're on a pretty solid path. We are aware of where some of the barriers are to doing better, and we've been very focused on implementation since July 1st, but now we're starting to talk about how are all these pieces really fitting together and where do we need to pay attention as we go forward. The other thing we introduced into the group care kind of thinking is we put in place in these contracts a no eject, no reject clause. We have had that in shelter care for years. And when we first did it in shelter care, people were flipped out. They didn't think it was going to work. They thought it was horrible. Everybody was worried about it. Within about 6 months, we got through all the bumps of that, and it's just the way we do business now. The same thing has happened when we introduced it into group care. They were flipped out. They were worried they were going to have kids that weren't appropriate for their facilities. They were worried that we wouldn't listen if we were referring kids who weren't appropriate. So far, the no eject, no reject thing has gone just fine. We've had a couple of appeals. We've worked through those. Everybody seems to be satisfied on all sides. But that is an important concept for example, our conversations with the MCOs. Because what used to happen before July 1st, if an MCO decertified a kid in group care and said, we're not going to give you BHIS services anymore, the facility would just call our worker and say, come pick them up. We're not keeping them. They can't do that now. And so it puts more onus on us in a central office perspective to have these conversations with the MCOs, because the facilities have to keep these kids now. I would continue to maintain that's a great thing. That's what should be happening. But it's also fair to say, from a provider perspective, somebody's got to carry the torch on our behalf to figure out if this kid needs BHIS services, get it for them, or find an appropriate level of care if they don't need those services. So it became kind of an elevated conversation from that perspective. Supervised apartment living, I said that took a little longer to implement. We made some big changes in the expectations for supervised apartment living. And that was honestly primarily because the kids that were being referred to that program were not necessarily appropriate for that program. What was happening is that when everybody ran out of other options for kids, they'd say, let's get them an apartment. Well, those were not the kids that needed to be in an apartment, let me just tell you. So we increased the age of eligibility. So, you know, you can't just plunk a 16-year-old into their own little scattered apartment where they're become party central, basically. We increased expectations on the providers from a performance perspective. And we limited, honestly, we give kids a stipend when they go into supervised apartment living. We had providers that were totally taking that stipend. So we had kids that were paying damage deposits or damage fees every single month, whether they damaged anything or not. Yeah, that isn't happening anymore. You know, the idea that when kids hit 18, they need to have enough money in savings to get their next apartment and to be able to pay their damage deposit and to have enough for rent was something that we worked really hard in this new procurement to maintain. So we had to have a little bit of a conversation with our providers. There are two pieces to supervised apartment living, if you don't know that. One is a clustered site, and a cluster site requires that there is staffing 24 hours a day. So it's smaller than a group care facility. It is less supervised than a group care facility, but they have to have staff on at all times to help our kids. When kids succeed in cluster site, then we have some scattered sites, which are more apartment-based. Still an expectation that they be seen regularly, that we're monitoring budgets and all that, that we're intervening on their behalf if they're having trouble with landlords, and we should be helping intervene and not yelling at the kid. But we tightened up all those expectations around supervised apartment living, because in general, our success rate was not good. And it was because of the kids we were placing there, it was because of the structure of the program, and it was because of the way we paid. So I'm hoping that we have addressed a lot of that. The providers are doing a really good job making the shifts that we've talked about. Sometimes it's harder for our workers and judges, frankly, because they still see it as kind of a placement decision of last resort, which it should not be. But I think it's on the ground okay and moving forward. Okay, so that was a long update, probably some things you didn't care about, but that's where we are. What can I answer for you? Either structurally at DHS, what questions do you have? Any of these contracts? Frankly, anything else that's going on at DHS, I'll take a run at if I know it. You know, we're kind of big, so any of those things. Yep. Yep, there absolutely is. So one of the things that we're good, oh, so summary of the question, are there exceptions, kind of? If there's a kid that needs a specific placement further away, is there a way to do that? And there absolutely is. There are out-of-service area placement protocols in place, and it may sound a little onerous, so the requesting service area has to contact the receiving service area, and they have a discussion about it. In practice, that's moving fairly quickly, so that's good. The reason we put that protocol in place is that we want to have the conversation. So one of the bottlenecks we have right now, Woodward is a very popular facility. And what's happened is that Chad Jensen, who is the chief here, and Mike McEnroy, who's the service area manager here, they can't get kids into Woodward and Des Moines because kids from all over the state are sitting there. So it's another good conversation, frankly, from my perspective, because now we have the SAMs and chiefs talking differently to each other about it. I was at the SAM chief meeting last week or the week before. They were complaining about this bottleneck in Des Moines. I brought the data for them and said, if you're having problems getting kids here, maybe you need to talk to Shirley, because she has 12 kids sitting here. Ruth has 10 kids sitting here. We have 40 beds at Lutheran that nobody's using at the moment that we're paying for because nobody will sit down with Lutheran and have a conversation about what these kids need. So yes, there is room for exception, but I think our eventual goal is to say it truly is an exception for kids to be so far away from their own families and communities. So those are the discussions that are happening. There's definitely a protocol. It is working. Kids are being placed in other service areas for those right reasons. But we force people now to have a conversation about it, which I think is really good. We have regular conversations with the chiefs about this charging issue. Scott Hobart is a great guy, right? I've known him since he was 12, probably. And he's a juvenile court chief in Davenport. He is reluctant to put kids on the path to delinquency. However, that is sometimes in conflict, from my perspective, with their whole emphasis on community safety. Kids have to be appropriately charged when they do things, right? We have lots of kids who are duly adjudicated, and the general conversation about that is supposed to be, and it was when I was a service area manager both in Davenport and Des Moines, if kids are duly adjudicated, the conversation should be, what is the crux of this problem? If the parents are primarily the issue, and their behavior is what's driving a lot of this stuff with kids, then reasonably DHS should be lead. If parents are doing everything they can reasonably be expected to do and these kids are out of control, they are delinquents, and they should be leading that charge. So that's part of the conversation. One of the things that happens with our facilities is that they want to be good vendors, and so if a chief or a juvenile court officer says we're not charging them, a lot of times they accommodate that. And what I've told facilities, if somebody assaults somebody and breaks a bone, you charge them. You press charges, right? And they don't do it because they want to accommodate the people who are paying the bills. Your specific question about visitation. The only thing that I would caution everybody about is historically, from a system perspective, kids will go on visits and then they act out. And our response typically is to say, then you can't have visits. Reasonably, if you were in that situation as a child and not able to see your family very often, and when you do, you wonder what the heck is going on in your life, you're going to reasonably act out. So acting out should be expected as part of this. Having said that, we should be looking at visitation plans that keep everybody safe, right? So maybe you don't get to go home for the weekend. Maybe your mom comes on campus where it's a little more contained, which should be an expectations for providers to make sure that's possible. But we pay regardless. So we pay regardless. So there is a performance measure about maintaining contact between kids and their families. So that's part of the way they push it. My concern about the way these contracts sometimes are implemented, and I'm confident we'll get there, It just is going to take the time to figure it out. The worst implementation strategy is to think about it really academically, like I'm fulfilling a contract obligation. You guys all know a contract is intended to implement good practice, and you can't do that academically. So with our foster care, our RTS provider, they consistently say, but we met the contract obligation. You are not meeting the intent. If kids are going home so that you can say, yep, we ticked off that box. Right. But everything is chaotic. That is not meaningful contact. It's not meaningful engagement, and it doesn't meet the intent. For your girl, I guess what I would suggest two things to you. If you have not had the opportunity to have a specific conversation about this stuff with Lori Frick or with Lori, and is she moving things the right direction from your perspective? Because she and Scott work well together. We have other areas of the state where the Chiefs and Sams get along kind of, but not really. They seem to get along really well and work well together. So do you hear them trying to move things the right direction, or not so much?
Probably not so much with this kid, other than I just heard the conversation within the last couple of weeks about, should we look at a supervisor or something? Probably because
Is this boy? I'm telling you right now, he's not getting it. No.
The
Oh, the girl.
And the girl has no business being out anywhere.
That's kind of typically the way that went. And, it's not right. That's not right. If she, regardless of whether she's been in a PMIC before, so let's just set that aside for a minute, because she has a horrible history, right? Bouncing.
Well,
To your point.
The problem with her whole situation is she's done really good sometimes, but there's no stable home for her to ever
Go back to.
But she's going there as soon as she turns 16.
Right.
So, and because Dad won't engage in services, because he just doesn't, he's not motivated, he'll visit her, but he doesn't want to engage in any services, then for the longest time they were separate, she couldn't do visits. I think we need to restructure, and I heard you say, most of these kids who age out of the system are going home.
Right.
Or they're going to someone that they know their relatives sometime.
Right. Most of them go home. So let me use this as a little bit of a springboard. If you think about these examples, how many of you have similar examples in your practice? So a pretty good number, right? Of the cases that you work, of the cases that you're involved in, what percentage do these two kind of represent? I know they're bad, but is it? Oh, for the love of God.
I have a kid who's been in care since he was 7. We had him stabilized in Wisconsin for years. It was amazing.
At Wildloosing?
Economawalk.
Oh, Economawalk, yeah.
And we couldn't keep him there because the funding wasn't there. So they moved him to Beloit, where he was perpetrated on. And then we moved him to Radnor. And then he got kicked out of Radnor because it's not in our service area. And he's now back in Hillcrest, which he's been in Hillcrest. I think they're restructuring their program, and there's some positive things there. But, I have my teenager kids, we're not getting any.
Not a huge chance of success, you're saying. Okay. Yes, sir.
Psychological eye, assessment, intensive group care, recommendation.
So did you guys all hear that question? 13-year-old not placed in the right place. There is nothing contractually that limits somebody's ability to ask for a cross-service area placement. Nothing. So when we talk about this stuff, there's always when we talk about how complicated it is, there are just different levels of discussion that have to happen. There are people doing it every day. I can tell you because I see them. I see those go back and forth. So does the contract limit or does practice limit it? It really does not. If there's a thought that that is the only place for the kid to go, those conversations are happening. In terms of who's responsible to look for her, the entire system is responsible to be doing due diligence to try to find her and making efforts and documenting efforts to try to find her. It would be focused on the JCO side in this case because she's a delinquent, but they are to be doing due diligence to try to be finding her. So the idea that somebody's just on run and she's a runner and what are you going to do is not acceptable anywhere. Not on our side, right, not on our side, not on their side. You know, we're supposed to be looking for kids and not just looking, but documenting those efforts regularly to try to figure out where she's at. The conversation that should be going on, though, would be, why is Clarinda the place for this kid? And can her needs be met in another facility appropriately? Fundamentally, when we started this conversation about foster group care, the first run at it was everybody saying, well, we place kids because that's the best place for them. When we dug into that deeper about, well, what does that mean? What therapeutic interventions are in this facility, being provided in this facility that are not being provided in this facility? Realistically, what it came down to is that workers place kids where workers are comfortable. Whether it is because the facility, it's the same thing with foster homes. You know, we have this huge conversation about our foster home capacity, and I can tell you I was a worker when DHS was doing our own matching. And if it was 4:30 on a Friday and a foster parent said yes, that was a match, right? That was the best place because they said yes. And I had a set of foster parents as a social worker too that I was comfortable talking to and working with. And we were really successful because we engaged with each other well. And that was the way the thing worked, as opposed to more of a discussion about really clinically, not just because they answer your calls, what is the clinical intervention that our kids are getting? If I were to ask you, for all the kids that you have placed in facilities, what is the clinical program that they are providing to your kids? My guess is that you would not be really sure. And that's a problem, just from a system perspective. To know that they keep them, to know that they call you back, to know whether they charge them or not, those things are kind of important. But the more important thing is to get those kids clinically what they need so that they can be successful once they leave. And I'm not sure we've put enough of an emphasis on that part. So when we talk about this kid needs to go to Clarinda, I would just ask the question, what is it that Clarinda is providing, or what do you think they're going to provide that nobody else closer to her can provide? Because if we're going to be successful, we have to be able to do that in more than one place. There can't just be, with the exception of a couple populations. So we've done something very specific with sex offenders, for example. Sex offenders need a very specific kind of treatment. And so we have carved out placement options for sex offenders across the state. We're starting to talk about kids with lower IQs. It was so funny in my conversation with the chiefs the other day, because they're like, before July 1st, we never had any of these low-functioning kids. And I said, well, they're not all that smart because they keep getting caught. So what? And really, when we really process through it, juvenile court officers make low-functioning kids chinas. That's what they do, right? And so we're now starting a similar conversation about low-functioning kids in a way that we talked about our sex offenders, because kids with IQs of 50 and 55 and 60, yeah, they're going to be victimized in a typical group care population. So we're starting to figure out, what do those kids look like? How do we program for them specifically? And how are we going to carve them out and make sure that they're taken care of clinically? But aside from those kind of specific populations, the idea that our facilities have to learn how to individualize their case planning to the extent that they can actually clinically help kids is something that we want to keep moving forward on. What else? How are we doing, buddy? Yeah. That's all right.
I don't know what it's like around the rest of the state, but I just felt it. We are, to say the least, having a bit of a crisis of staffing and caseloads and stuff. Is that happening around the state?
It is. I think there's a Register article today, maybe. I got a bling on my phone. Every time they say child welfare, I get a little notification. Because before I did that, honestly, I get up every day and stop and buy a Monster drink at this one Quick Trip, you know, where everybody knows your name kind of a deal. And after our legislative oversight testifying marathon thing, I went and got my little Monster drink, and I stood up at the counter to pay, and I looked down, and I was like above the fold on the front page of the Register. And I know I looked up at the clerk, and she's like, I know, right? She's like, we were hoping you'd come in. This is on us today. You have enough trouble. Just take your drink and go. So now I have a little notification. Every time they do something on child welfare, I get a little bling so I can see. The way that we allocate staff in the field, and this has been true since I was a service area manager 100 years ago, each service area is given an allocation of staff, right? So you get numbers. The first thing we do is identify how many social worker 3s we need, which are our assessors. So we try to keep their caseloads between 12 and 15 a month. That is an average. So some months they'll do 20, some months they may do 6, but on average they're doing 12 to 15 a month. Those workers come off the top. Then we look at the social worker 2s, and we have tried to keep their caseloads for those that are doing case management in child welfare, because social worker 2s do a lot of stuff in our agency, but for those that are actually managing child welfare cases, we try to keep their caseloads between 20 and 25. That's big, right? That's bigger than any national recommendation, but those workers then come off the top. Whatever we have left goes to income maintenance. So when you think about our field staff, it's not just the social work side, it's all those folks that are doing eligibility for FIP and food assistance and Medicaid and child care. That's what's left. So in terms of caseload sizes, we would say they're too high, especially for social worker 2s. The balance, though, that you guys don't care about, nor should you, but that we have to pay attention to. When I first started as a manager at DHS, the income maintenance caseloads were 350. So they were handling 350 cases a worker with pretty much a 0 error rate. So on the income maintenance side, on the benefit side, for food assistance, for Medicaid, for child care, if there's an error, you have problems. Today, their caseloads are about 1,100. So every income maintenance worker is handling 1,100 cases, and it is complicated. So that's the way staff are appropriated in the field. I would anticipate there's going to be a conversation about that out of at least one of our little investigative groups, if not all of them. And the issue for us is we implement what is legislated. So we have asked for additional resources at times. Sometimes you get them, sometimes you don't. We have implemented across the board cuts when that has been legislated, 5%, 10% across the board. So caseloads are high across the state, and they cover a lot of territory. So we have arguments about things like windshield time, so urban, rural, You know, how far apart are our families? That Council Bluffs service area starts here at Des Moines and goes all the way to the border, up and down, right? So the short answer is yes, we know caseloads are high, and they're high across the state. Our income maintenance staff have honestly been able to manage their caseloads because we've invested a lot in IT systems that allow them to work cases no matter where they are in the state. So if you have an influx of cases in Des Moines, somebody in Lamoni can actually work that case on the income maintenance side. In child welfare, you can't do that. So I'd tell you to take a look at the Register article. I think it's today, right? That it went through and really went from 2002 or so, right? Maybe, and then till now. And I think, kind of what I articulated is pretty accurate. That the 3s have stayed pretty steady, the 2s have increased, and they didn't mess with income maintenance at all because they're really they're focused on child welfare. But that's what's happened in income maintenance. The big thing I would tell you is to not get so frustrated with what's going on in our system that you don't continue to communicate what your concerns are. And every once in a while, if something goes nice, we like to hear it too. That doesn't usually happen, but it could. Your input as it relates to your representation on all sides, whether it's as an attorney for the child, a guardian ad litem representing parents, is critically important to us continuing to push in the right direction as we evolve this thing. So, and honestly, if you are, I will always ask you, have you had conversations with local leadership? Because a lot of this is practice stuff. It's not so much contractual. It's somebody saying, I can't even ask. Well, yes, you can, so I will always ask you if you've talked to somebody locally. But if you're not getting satisfaction at the local level, let me tell you, people know how to find me. People know how to find Vern Armstrong. And our job is not to do kind of that I gotcha thing. Our job is to dig in and try to help things get better and to support the practice in the way that we want it to evolve. So don't get so frustrated that you don't keep talking about it with people and trying to solution around it. Really, because our kids and families depend on you. So that continued involvement is critically important. If you guys have any other things that you think about or that you talk about later in the day that you want to ask me, these guys know how to get a hold of me, and I will get back to you. It's helpful sometimes if you say, this is where I saw you, because I do a lot of these. But other than that, if there are things that come up that you did not think about that become part of the conversation today, don't hesitate to ask about them. Don't hesitate to ask for us to come out to your local areas to have more of this conversation. We go all over the state trying to help local areas figure out how to do this better and to figure out if there's something we can do contractually to make it easier. Okay. Anything else I didn't say that you wanted to hear? Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.